Good morning. I'm excited to get started today. Our first session is with two folks from the Center for Democracy and Technology. First, we have Alexandra Reeve Givens. She is the president and CEO. Prior to that, she was director at the Institute of Technology, Law, and Policy at Georgetown, where she taught classes on that very subject. And we also have with us Jake LaPeroux. He's deputy director, and prior to that was senior counsel at the Constitution Project at the Project of Government Oversight, and prior to that at the Open Technology Institute. Between the two of them, they have a lot of knowledge and deep history in this space. We have talked a lot so far in the fellowship about, some of the nitty gritty of, what this means for HIPAA, what this means for abortion, all sorts of things. They today and actually our session later today are going to focus a bit more on the macro. What does this mean for society? What does this mean for democracy, for civil rights? And so I'm very much looking forward to hearing from them, and won't you join me in giving them a warm welcome?
Well, hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And you've had a double header of CDT folks because you saw our colleague Riddhi Shetty yesterday. Just to spend 30 seconds on CDT in case Riddhi wasn't able to give the overview. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit based here in Washington, DC, and also in Brussels that focuses on civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age. We do a lot of work these days on reproductive privacy, a lot of work on consumer privacy writ large, on government surveillance, on online expression, election integrity, and also how government is using technology in the delivery of services for citizens and how to make sure that that's used fairly and equitably. We thought what we would do today in this session focused on biometrics and democracy is a deep dive on face recognition technology. And then once we've taken you on that journey, which we're going to do quite quickly, open it up for a broad discussion where we're happy to go even deeper on face recognition if you're interested, or move into other spaces as well. But we think this is an important one because use is growing across the United States and also around the world. And face recognition technology raises really significant questions for democracy. I'll spend just a couple minutes doing kind of the very high level overview of how face recognition technology works. It is, as you think, the recognition of people's faces from images or video. And just to explain momentarily the technology, what's so powerful about this is that it is software that is able to analyze an image through video footage or through a still image and extract characteristics of how people's features are positioned on their face in relationship to one another, get that down into code for very easy comparison to a vast database of other images. And it's able to happen very quickly, very efficiently. And that is what has led to the proliferation of the technology at such a large scale. There are two big categories of face recognition technology. One is verification, right? That's what gets you to unlock your phone. That's doing one-to-one matching. Does the image that is being shown to the camera at that moment match the image that they already have of somebody for their identity? The other is using face recognition for identification. And this is what's being used in law enforcement investigations, policing, surveillance, et cetera. We're going to focus on that second one, face recognition identification. And the way that the technology works now is you can have examples from live face recognition analysis. So this can be analyzing camera footage as people walk through a crowd against a watch list of people that law enforcement might be looking out for. And then there's also retrospective face recognition, which will be looking at video footage from an incident after it has happened to identify people who were there. Each of these approaches have been used and are being used right now, and I'll touch on a couple of examples just to help you think about some of the circumstances that we worry about the most in our line of work. So one of the most notorious examples that I'm sure you're all familiar with is the use of face recognition technology in China, where face recognition has been used very specifically for racial profiling of the Uyghur population. And here, quite literally, what you are having is that cameras that are deployed across the region operate with a software that is looking for people who are perceived to be weaker based on assumptions about their appearances, and people who get that marker are being tracked and surveilled. Their comings or goings are being recorded. We also have in countries from Russia to Hong Kong to Uganda to Iran and others, the use of face recognition to identify people who are attending political protests. Those have been well documented. Dissidents have been raising concerns about this for some time. Sometimes we have instances of it leading to direct repercussions for people in those crowds. In Iran, the government announced that it intends to use face recognition technology to police laws about which women are using the hijab. And if you're not complying very specifically with those laws, the technology is able to identify who is not complying for subsequent action. And Russia, even just recently, has reportedly been using face recognition technology to track down deserters or people that are not doing draft evasion for service in Ukraine right now, to police that law as well. But there are other examples that are closer to home too. We'll touch on a couple of them. Since at least 2020 in the United Kingdom, police have run programs to identify criminal suspects in real time. This has received quite a lot of news attention and political pushback in the country. But there are multiple pilot operations right now where they've set up cameras in busy areas, think Trafalgar Square or Piccadilly Circus or King's Cross Station. And what they're doing is looking for a group. They've created a kind of a short list of about, the first pilot was for 2,500 people who are suspects for major violent crimes. And what they are doing is putting out cameras in major places and comparing who's walking by against that watch list to try and find them. And there are police nearby who are ready to make arrests if somebody who's on that watch list is identified in the crowd. In a single session at Oxford Circus, they captured and analyzed the images of 16,000 people who walked by in the course of a day, and it did lead to some arrests. This is also happening in the United States. So in 2020, state law enforcement in Florida was found to have repeatedly used face recognition technology to identify and catalog peaceful protesters at rallies to celebrate Juneteenth, to push back against police violence. In Baltimore, facial recognition technology was also used in the protests following the death of Freddie Gray. We can talk more in depth in the Q&A about some of the real concerns in this space. I'm going to touch on a couple here now just to get you thinking. The first and most important one to call out is that a biometric identifier is very different than something like your address or your email address or even your name, which it is easier to mask or to change over time. Once the government has your face and is able to identify you, you're not changing that, right? It's also very hard to cover it. It is more socially acceptable now than it was recently to wear masks, but it is still, an unusual thing to walk down the street. And actually in the UK, a man was arrested and he paid a $90 fine for disorderly conduct for masking his face when this policing program was going on, because the police thought that he was trying to evade the program, even though he wasn't on the list. Face identification is also different in kind from other biometrics like fingerprint testing or even DNA sampling. And the reason is we tend to know if your fingerprint is being taken, right? That it tends to be, that's an interaction with a law enforcement officer. You know that it is happening and it is at a single point in time, and the same with DNA testing as well. For face recognition, it can be done at a distance. You may not know that you are being tracked or identified, and it can be persistent over time anywhere you're going. So there's a difference in kind, there's a difference in scale. One of the key concerns that's been raised about face recognition, and you're going to hear more about this in the coded bias later today, is real concerns about accuracy and bias. And this has been shown over and over again through different academic research studies and government studies as well. The most famous and kind of groundbreaking of this was the gender shades study, which led to the coded bias presentation I think you'll hear more about later today. But even NIST has also done research to show real concerns about bias and accuracy in these systems. There have been some famous cases of misidentification. The ACLU has a lawsuit right now over a man who was misidentified through face recognition technology and was arrested and ended up spending 30 hours in jail for no reason whatsoever, just because his face print had been misidentified. But I think what's most fundamentally important to realize, and then I'm going to pass it over to Jake, is that this is not just about questions of bias or inaccuracy. Even if this tool were the most accurate thing in the world, the examples that I started with, I hope, give a sense of why we need to worry about the fundamental use of this technology as a threat to freedom, to people's right to go out into open spaces and convene with others without fear of who might be tracking and cataloging them as they do so. And so while we need to think about bias and accuracy for all of the ways in which it is deepening existing inequalities in the criminal justice system, the inquiry, and importantly newspaper coverage, can't just stop there. We really need to question the fundamental threat to freedom that come from such a pervasive use of technology.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary of sort of why facial recognition is so important, and both in terms of just criminal justice and police work, and also kind of in that larger sense for democratic values. I think when you look at surveillance work, a lot of it comes down to not necessarily what's a private place inside your house, what's a public place in the streets. It's about what does the government have the capacity to know about you, and what information can it collect on a mass scale? How much effort does it take to do that? And facial recognition is one of those tools that really is a qualitative changer for, if we don't put legal limits on it, what the government can know about you, what you're doing, who is a dissident, who is a protester, in ways that I think are not compatible with democracy if we do not have proper limits on them. So that kind of being the full scope of sort of why this is important, I wanted to give a little discussion of sort of what is the landscape and layout of facial recognition right now. This tech is shockingly prevalent right now in our society. As far as we know, at least 1 in 4 police departments have the capacity to use facial recognition. At least half of all federal law enforcement agencies with law enforcement capabilities and roles use facial recognition. The FBI, which is probably the biggest federal user of the technology, they run thousands of facial recognition scans every single month, sometimes for their own investigations, sometimes to assist state and local law enforcement. Just some vendors like Clearview AI is the one that has always gathered the most press. There are thousands of police departments that use them. And probably the most worrisome thing about all this is probably just the tip of the iceberg, because all those stats that we know have come from a lot of investigative work amid the fact that most law enforcement use of facial recognition is hidden, and is hidden by design, because of the accuracy problems of the tech, because of all these technical features of when it is or isn't reliable. It is very usually hidden from defendants and hidden from courts, and not submitted to defendants as part of Brady disclosures, and not submitted into court as evidence. The goal is basically to use it as a lead to create the foundation of a case, and then kind of not pretend it was not there as far as actually going into court or actually talking to defendants. You'll see warrant applications that will just say, technology used, or techniques used that are the basis for this warrant, because they do not want it in court. They do not want to have to pick through those details. So this is something that we both know is prominent, and also is probably much more prominent than we have a clear picture of. As far as kind of the legislative and policy landscape, I for a long time have described facial recognition as a Wild West. There are not many laws on it. That fortunately has changed a little bit. I think in a lot of places it is still sadly a Wild West where there are virtually no rules, but we have actually seen, I think, a lot of momentum in this space for the past few years. In the past several years, right around kind of the time that the Black Lives Matter movement started, we started to see a series of bans on facial recognition in cities. That's passed in a number of prominent and large cities: San Francisco, Oakland, Boston, a number of others. This also is not always just by city councils. Portland, Maine passed a ban on facial recognition by a popular referendum. So that I think kind of, and that, Portland, that is not as liberal a place as San Francisco. So I don't think this is also relegated to places of, it's like, a very kind of, like out there jurisdiction. And in more recent years, as kind of that ban momentum has slowed a little bit, we've started to see full states step in and start to put on limits. So there are now over a dozen states that have some form of significant limit on facial recognition, be it a requirement to go to court, or a limit that can only be used for serious crimes as opposed to misdemeanors or nonviolent crimes, actual requirements that if police use it, they have to tell defendants to give them the right to examine it and talk about it in court. Putting limits on how much you can use it for a case. There's some very notorious cases where basically there was a match and someone was arrested purely based on the match. So some states are starting to put in laws to say you can't do that. And then rules about accuracy testing, accuracy standards, bias testing. So these are the rules we're starting to see in place, and I think we're starting to see kind of a formula of this sort of not silver bullet, but silver BB approach to, because facial recognition creates all these different dangers from, like Alex was saying, it is dangerous when it doesn't work, and it is dangerous in a different way when it does. So there's not going to be one policy that, oh, that solves it. You need a bunch. You probably need something like a warrant rule for trying to limit abuse, but also, even if you have a warrant rule that says, oh, this is the person you're looking for, you have to make sure you don't just say, that's the scan, the match came back this, so let's go arrest the guy, because that's happened before and you arrest an innocent person and throw them in jail. And it's very bad, even if you correct it later. So you really, I think we do want that comprehensive approach. We've seen a lot of states kind of start to look at these different policies, and I think hopefully we're building to the idea that we need kind of that sort of comprehensive set. So that's the state level. Federally has been admittedly more of a challenge. I think there's been a lot of interest at the federal level and a lot of consensus that this is a problem, but we really haven't seen movement on bills. We've seen a few bills introduced. There was a moratorium bill that was introduced in the last two Congresses. There have been a couple more piecemeal items. And then most recently, there was a really interesting bill that CDT supports that did kind of pull from all those different state policies and sort of put in, I think, probably slightly better than what you've seen most of the states' version of those different ideas: warrants, crime limits, notice requirements, limiting on how much evidentiary value you can attach to a match, accuracy and bias testing, et cetera. Something like that, I hope, can really start to move the discussion forward. But so far in the congressional level, we've had a few hearings, and a lot of congressional hearings you will probably go to is a lot of shouting and a lot of yelling at each other and a lot of very passionately talking about issues that are completely different than the things at the hearing. Facial recognition, the hearings we've had have been very different than that. It's a lot of vigorous, intense agreement. And everyone kind of saying, yes, this is a very scary tech. This is not regulated enough. And you have all the Republicans saying, yes, Premier Jayapal is exactly right. And all the Democrats saying, yes, Jim Jordan is exactly right. And it's kind of a bizarro world. It's like, wow, there's a lot of potential here. And then kind of nothing has happened after that. So I'm hoping maybe that is something that could change, especially in the new Congress, when it's going to take bipartisan agreement to get anything done, that they might say, oh, this is actually one of those things we could get done. But we will have to see if there is kind of the desire to follow through on that. So that's kind of where we are in the legislative landscape right now. As far as what we might see going forward, I mean, that federal question I think is a really important one of, is there going to be kind of that interest of, now that anything we pass, we have to have bipartisanship, maybe it's an opportunity for it. There's a few different kind of types of emerging facial recognition that I very much worry about. One is what Alex mentioned, untargeted scans. So this is when most law enforcement uses today, you have a photo or CCTV, you have one person's face, I want to identify that face. You put the face in, you get a match, or more likely you get a set of matches. Untargeted scans, which is pretty prominent in places like China. As Alex said, the UK has tried it pretty unsuccessfully. The error rates in their pilots have been astronomical, is where you basically are scanning every single face as it goes by against a watch list, and it sets off, a red flag if someone on the watch list is there. As far as we know, there haven't been any active pilots or programs by US police departments on this, but I think it's only a matter of time till it's coming. I mean, it has been attempted in the UK. We're starting to see prominent examples of private entities like casinos are rolling this out. One thing I would say is, if you want to know what kind of where police surveillance is headed in the next year or two, look at what casinos are doing now, because that's a whole different policy discussion. But there is a very kind of interesting sort of casinos are very often the petri dish for pervasive surveillance. And this is one technology they're very interested right now and are trying to perfect for, seeing if people on their blacklists are trying to come into casinos. And I expect police departments are soon going to want to pick that up. So I very much worry about untargeted systems. I mean, just the risk profiles are really severe there. Imagine, someone's walking down the street and suddenly, they get flagged as a bench warrant and it's a mismatch and a police officer is going up to them. A lot of cases of police brutality or fatalities we see are from these very minor offenses where someone gets pulled over for, an unpaid parking ticket, a traffic violation, something like that. And if you have someone who's being, grabbed in the street because a camera said that they're, a murderer or something that they're not, that's, I think, creates a lot of risks. Another area that I worry about that's emerging is personal use facial recognition. So this is not necessarily in the hands of law enforcement through a set algorithm, but what if a company scrapes every photo off of Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and puts it in a database and then puts an app on your phone that says, go take a picture of someone and then tell me who they are. This is something there's been a few cases of. There's a company in the US called Pimize that does this now. There's been some other, it's a little more prominent in other countries, like Russia's had apps on this for a while. I think it was called Fine Face, if I remember right. And all the kind of bad uses you could imagine from that are exactly what have happened from it. It's used for stalking, it's used for harassment, it's used for doxing people. There was one kind of test study where an engineer abroad did this and said, oh, I'll use this to see if your girlfriend is online in a sex video and track it down. And you had all of these kinds of people going and harassing people online or trying to de-anonymize people in porn videos and sex shaming them. It's a very dangerous tech that I don't think should be there for just free use to identify anyone, anywhere, at any time. That idea of really ending anonymity or obscurity seems very dangerous. So I hope that's something else we might find ways to put some rules around before the sort of Pandora's box is permanently opened. And then less kind of on the emerging tech side of it, but more sort of the emerging how it's going to be talked about. I really am curious about, as we start to get more of these notice requirements in states, as we start to have more common knowledge for defense attorneys that this is a tech being used and this is how you, even if it's not disclosed to you like it should be, how to press for it. How is that going to be analyzed and looked through in court? Alex talked a bit about the bias issue, which is certainly a big problem with facial recognition accuracy. Even if that bias problem is solved, facial recognition is never going to be perfectly accurate because it is so situational. It depends on the angle of the face, it depends on lighting, it depends on camera quality. And I think a big challenge that we face is it's very easy if you're a jury in a court, if you hear someone say, I'm a witness and I saw 5 feet away someone get shot and I saw the shooter and that's him. Okay, that's a very reliable witness. They're very close. And clearly if someone's, the key witness is someone who says, I was about 300 feet away, it was dark, I kind of got to look at his face from the side and I think that was him. Much as we instinctively sort of understand the context of that. It's a lot harder to tell a jury, oh, well, they had the confidence threshold setting at 90% instead of 99%, which is industry standard for use of this, or pixel quality was at 200 per inch instead of 300 per inch. None of that makes sense to a layperson, as it shouldn't, and it's a lot, you don't have the kind of context the same way you do of, yeah, I understand a person seeing a face and recognizing it. So that's an area where as this starts to get into court, I hope we can have an effective job of sort of being able to educate folks on when it is reliable, when it's not, and to what extent.
You talked about the bills that are sort of being considered. I was wondering which uses those limit. Are those purely about about the police use of facial recognition, or would those also place limitations on the other examples you gave, casinos, or even on basic research into improving the technology?
The ones I've looked at are mostly the law enforcement uses. Some go into kind of civic use. There's one bill, the No Biometric Barriers to Housing Act, which would try to limit use of facial recognition for public housing, avoid situations where someone's trying to get into their own home, the camera looks at them, it has an error rate, and all of a sudden, instead of getting to your house, you're having the police called and asking if you're breaking in, something like that. As far as commercial uses, I'm less focused on those types of bills. Alex, you might know from our kind of work on
Do you want to talk
privacy data.
about BIPA quickly?
Yeah, that's a very good example. So one state law in Illinois kind of looks at this from a consumer angle as far as limiting biometric collection and use of data. And that's in a very interesting way sort of flown over into the surveillance context, because one of these companies I mentioned before, Clearview AI, they also do that business model of let's scrape everything off the internet, all the Facebook photos, all the Instagram photos, ID them, put them in a database, and now we have a massive database. And that seems to be a pretty clear violation of BIPA, this law that limits, with some pretty effective rules, how you can collect and use individuals' biometric data. They're currently engaged in one suit around that and have settled in another suit, and that the one they settled in addition to some pretty hefty fines, basically cut off their use of commercial facial recognition for anything other than use with law enforcement and government. So that company I mentioned before, PimEyes, that's doing this same thing. If we have everyone's database, maybe we can just put it on our phone and let you use it. My reading of that settlement is this would basically cut Clearview off from trying to shift their business model the same way.
Okay. So I work for a local newsroom in North Carolina, and I'm wondering if I wanted to tell, whether our local police department was using this, like what is the best way to do that? Is that the budget, or do you have any other tips?
I think FOIA processes and public records vary so much state to state, but that usually I think is the best way. I mean, sometimes you can just ask them. There are some departments that are, they might not give you full details, but are open about the fact that they use it. But FOIA requests, that is how we know a lot of what we know. That kind of, the fact that 1 in 4 police departments has the capacity, that's from a project that Georgetown's Center on Privacy Technology did for a long time, mostly based on FOIA. The stories out of Florida that Alex mentioned about it being used on protesters, that was from a Florida Sun Sentinel report that I think all came from their own FOIA investigations. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to find out there, both in terms of use, but also one thing that's always really fascinated me from kind of when reporters will have a facial recognition story and looking through the documents is a lot of the advertising and the training materials that come from the vendors. And that kind of goes to that accuracy point of there's so much noise between the sort of, every now and then you'll get a memo of like, here's how to actually use this in a responsible way. But there's a lot of, shiny marketing language. And if that's how police are reading to use this tech, it's very scary because a lot of people like, you will identify people instantly. You will have an exact match of your suspect. I mean, there was one report where like in the same batch of documents, you had one memo from, I think it was Clearview, saying, we cannot reliably identify someone if they're wearing a mask or sunglasses or a hat or it's a bad angle. And then like the next document is like, an ad flyer emailed to that same police department for them saying, Clearview is so good that even if the person is wearing sunglasses and a hat and is at a bad angle, you can identify them. Like, what are we doing here? So again, yeah, I think it can give the context of is it being used and how much, but also what are the ways it's being used? And yeah, is it potentially being used in kind of whether just because there's not that much knowledge or because potentially a vendor that wants to make their product look extra shiny is giving a little too much exaggeration on it that it might be not used responsibly.
And just to put a fine point on one thing Jake mentioned in passing, so in 2016, Georgetown's Center on Privacy and Technology did this statewide, state-by-state, countrywide series of FOIA requests to law enforcement to try and understand what their face recognition technology was, and in particular where they were sourcing their information from, who was sharing photos for purposes of these matching databases. And so you can actually go, the website is theperpetuallineup.org. And even though it's some of the information is now dated, it can be a really nice starting point to see what's happening in your state. And that might give you some hooks and some ideas for when you then try and do updated FOIA requests, now these multiple years later.
Okay, I have 2 questions. They're completely unrelated. But one is, the FBI did use facial recognition technology for January 6th. And so I would love for you to talk about, and even kind of talk about guardrails, but like, can this be used responsibly, or are there reasons where this might be useful? And then the second is actually, I'm seeing reports about using this technology in schools, which is not commercial and it's not really a government space. So how do you tell your audience about this in a way that gives them options and doesn't just, I mean, I would actually be interested in any research on usefulness in schools, like with young faces.
Yeah, so on the first question, to work in civil liberties, right, is to deal with circumstances, right? Yes, of course, investigative techniques are useful, right? And you can come up with a fact pattern where you don't like the behavior the person was engaging in, and there it feels okay. But if you extend it from January 6th protests to Black Lives Matter protests, how do you feel, and is that different? And I think that's one of the really hard things to convey in stories, but as advocates, it's something we feel strongly about, which is we need to try and have consistent principles on this and warn that when a technology is dangerous, the technology is dangerous, even if there are sympathetic fact patterns where one might empathize with the goals of law enforcement. And I think that comes up kind of again and again. I'd love for you to jump in on that question too, and then we can go to schools after.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to think about also is sort of when you talk about those kind of use cases, a lot of time those will get thrown out and the question becomes, well, are the type of limits we're talking about, do those interfere with the use cases, and also do they interfere with the ones we care about? So I mean, something like a warrant requirement for facial recognition, that really wouldn't have any impact on potential use for something like January or any really sort of serious crime. I mean, the most common use case for police for facial recognition is, well, we have someone committing an assault, an armed robbery, a homicide. We have a picture of their face. We want to do it. It would not be hard in those cases to go to a judge and say, we have probable cause to believe that this person in the video shooting someone is the person in the video shooting someone. So that is the type of limit that I think would, for legitimate use cases, provide very little obstruction. But if they want to use it to identify a bunch of protesters or demonstrators at a Juneteenth event that's completely peaceful, that type of limit suddenly is very, very effective. So a lot of the times it's, I think, kind of looking at those sort of concerns of, is this going to interfere with it or not? I mean, there was a bill that almost passed in Massachusetts a couple of years ago for a lot of really strong limits, a warrant requirement like that. Then Governor Baker, he did sort of a partial veto, which is how the process works there, saying, well, we can't ban this tech because it's used to investigate homicides. Nothing in the bill would have stopped it from being investigative homicides. It was a warrant rule. It was a crime limit that it could only be used for serious violent felonies, not someone stealing a 6-pack from a CVS and things like that, which is also how it is commonly used in a way that I worry could be very problematic in the discretion, and also very problematic in cases like that don't get the scrutiny they need for a still pretty unstable forensic technology. So yeah, I think it often comes down to matching the what are the limits we want with what are the use cases for public safety that folks want. In surveillance policy all the time, usually there's a lot of big overlap of these limits are desirable and these use cases are desirable, and they don't interfere with each other.
And then on the school piece, so yes, that is a very active place. The other kind of an analogous fact pattern is landlords that are thinking about using it in their residential complexes. And in both cases, the use case presented is safety. And I think a number of concerns still come up in that space. One, with schools, I mean, at a very basic level, there's a question of just resources and the increasing kind of policification and militarization of school campuses in response to very legitimate concerns about school shootings. But when you think about how resources are being allocated, is that an appropriate way when those tools tend to be quite so expensive? Relatedly, I mean, so there are kind of a couple different ways in which the technology might be used in that space. One is that they, say, well, you'll have security cameras around schools, and we'll be doing matching so that if somebody that is unknown to the school community is on campus, we would find that out. Sure, yes, but also a lot of the shooters in schools, very sadly, are actually of the school community. And so I think there are some really meaningful questions there about kind of effectiveness for the fact patterns that people actually need to worry about. On top of that, Jake raised earlier this risk of when misidentification or false identification has very serious real world consequences, right? If somebody is being misidentified, it can lead to an encounter with law enforcement or with a school safety officer that, in the worst case scenario, can lead to violence and to death. We have seen it. But even short of that, you think of that in the school environment, what it is to be othered, what it is to be questioned as to whether or not you belong on campus. And it's because the school is using faulty technology that is disproportionately impacting people with darker skin tones, for example. It's just a really dangerous road to go down. So that's one where I think the questions of accuracy and bias actually are very meaningful into the inquiry as to usage, as well as kind of what are the appropriate ways to allocate limited school resource budgets, and is an investment in tech the way to do it, versus some of the very meaningful human resource issues that school campuses face.
Yeah, I mean, this has become a bit of a pattern after every type of like school shooting and tragedy that you hear a bunch of like, let's use this new shiny tech or that new shiny surveillance tech, and facial recognition has been kind of always in the mix. And I do honestly find it kind of a bit enraging as a just sort of attempt to sort of cash grab off these tragedies, because there is zero evidence that a tool like this would be effective. And there's a lot of very clear reasons why it would not. I mean, Alex already talked about like the fact that, even if you're putting on these watch lists, a lot of the time it's not going to be someone who's going to be flagged from that. It's going to be, unfortunately, a student or someone who's involved in the school or a former student. Another is the fact that for facial recognition to be reliable, a lot of the time you do need a clear photo. So, I mean, could you potentially identify people going to schools if you, the same way, quite often now if you're boarding an international flight, go stand with a lot of clear light in front of a clear background, wait for 5 seconds as it takes a picture. Sure, if a dangerous person is running past a camera into a school, you're not going to have a clear image like that. It's not going to be able to flag it properly. So again, and then you have all these issues of how does bias compare with that? How often is this going to be triggering false alarms for students, inside their own school? So I think it's an area where it's just there is no evidence it would be effective. There's a lot of very clear logical hurdles that I think would never stop it from being effective, and yet sort of it just gets thrown out there as an idea of why not do this, why not do that, in a way that I think is pretty clearly sort of a selfish attempt by the vendors of sort of, this horrible thing happened, you feel like you want to do something, why not buy my thing?
Are there any laws that would prevent it, like COPA or any biometrics, like do not gather data on kids?
I'm not sure how something like that would apply there. I mean, some of the various state and local bills trying to pose limits on this will do it not only as far as saying the police can't use it, but also any type of government entity like a school. So some of those, as far as, I'm not sure how COPA would apply in this case. That's an interesting question.
Yeah. You asked if there was any writing on this. So CDT, we actually have a student privacy team that just focuses on the use of technology in education spaces. So we've written about this. You can find it on our website. And I'll just mention here, actually, there's an analogous, not in the biometric space. I'm going to take us out of the topic of this week for a moment, but around the use of student social media monitoring. And that's another tool that in the wake of school shootings is being increasingly packaged up and sold to schools as well. We're going to look at the social media of all of your students, and what they're doing is looking for red flags for students with who might be expressing indicators of violence. That has a ton of very real concerns about what that means for students' expression, about the school to prison pipeline. So we have in-depth reporting and studies of students, teachers, parents, how they feel about that. That's on the CDT website too. And it's an interesting that those two stories go together because, to Jake's point, very often these are packaged up as solutions in the wake of very, very real concerns, but they come with very dangerous trade-offs, and it's the marginalized students in schools that end up suffering the most as a result.
So I have a question, but first I wanted to offer a resource to one of the earlier questions. For local reporting, EFF has a really great resource. It's called, I think it's Atlas of Surveillance, just Atlas Surveillance or surveillanceatlas.org or something like that. I've used that a lot. And then my question was, you were talking earlier about the two types of uses for biometrics, so verification and identification. And I was curious if there are concerns about verification as well.
Yeah, so that's a great one. I'm going to answer with the phrase ID me. For anyone that was following the news cycle this summer, they had a rough one around kind of government use of face recognition for verification purposes to access government services. So for those of you who weren't in the weeds of this GovTech debacle, ID.me is a private company that is used by a large number of government agencies at the state and local level and now the federal. To help with identity verification, in particular when you're trying to access government benefits. And the IRS got in the crosshairs of it this summer because they announced that they were going to start using ID.me verification if you wanted to access the IRS website to gain information. Some of you may have experienced this yourself, actually, trying to go to the IRS website. And it led to a big backlash for a couple of different reasons. One, not surprisingly, it's a big access question. Because for the technology to work, you need to have a smartphone with a camera that can easily take a picture of you and use that as the gateway. And when you think about the large number of different benefits programs that are run around the country, often the people that are receiving those are not people that are necessarily going to have a camera-enabled smartphone and be able to engage with that. So that raises one set of questions. The questions of bias and accuracy do as well. And it also raises this very fundamental question about when the government is contracting with third parties to provide those services and what is the security, data privacy practices for a company that ultimately, the government is basically mandate that you share very personal and private information with those companies as a condition of getting the government services to which you are legally entitled. So the IRS actually ended up backing off over that. They've slowed down their rollout, but that company is still very widely used. And so I think those questions are going to remain for a long time about kind of what is the appropriate way of doing ID verification. There are analogous and very interesting conversations in other countries as well. So the Aadhaar program in India is probably the most famous one of these, where they have rolled out biometric identification as a way of accessing almost all government services. And it is one that uses, and there are other countries that have followed suit as well. And there they've had a large number of very real access issues. Very real issues when there's an error in the tech or it's not working. And this is literally the way in which you get your access to food benefits, which was the issue with one of the India programs that was impacted. I mean, devastating impact on families, like in the immediate effect with no, in that case, they didn't have good programming in place to give people an alternative or a backup at all. So this is part of a much bigger conversation around how government is using technology and making sure that they're doing so in a way that is really thinking about these potential risks, these potential harms. And I will say, CDT is a pragmatic organization. We understand why, of course, governments want to reduce fraud. They want efficient systems. So we're not saying, no tech ever, it's not going to work that way. But what we do say is you have to be really careful in how you roll out these programs, really have to think about some of these barriers, have to think about what the analog alternatives are for people that have access issues, and make sure that they are very rigorously testing these systems before and after they're deployed.
If I can ask a follow-up to that, I guess part of my question is like, where's the line, right? Because even a photograph is a biometric. It is biometrics, right? So, and with ID.me, I did follow that, and it seemed like part of the issue was that it was a third party as opposed to the government, and it required, technology and all of that. But so, where is the line? Because we are okay with giving our photographs for all of our ID cards and all of that. So is it analog versus digital? Is it the newness of some of this technology? Where do you see that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an application issue. I mean, it's increasingly diversifying, but the two main avenues that most law enforcement databases for face recognition are used are mugshot photos, which come with a lot of their own issues of kind of, those are not based on convictions, those are based on arrests, and arrests are often not actually something that leads to convictions and are very disproportionate in how they break down, but also DMV databases. That's a very common source for law enforcement use of facial recognition. One of these things that Congress in their hearings where they've all agreed so much and then kind of left and not done things yet that we want them to is there was a lot of consternation when it originally came to light that people's DMV photos, you go to I think about somewhere between a dozen and 20 states, their photos are just fed into facial recognition systems now. everyone's DMV photos. And it's like, wait, I didn't agree to that. I didn't consent to that. I didn't even know that. So, I think it becomes an issue of, yeah, I mean, photos are, I think, kind of going to become a common thing in the same way that as much as it often makes me uncomfortable, I don't think we're going to be able to scale back the just sheer dragnet of CCTV that we have in major cities like Washington and Chicago and New York. It becomes a question of when you have a remote biometric identification tool like this, is that something you're going to combine with your databases of photos that you have for other purposes? Is it something you're going to combine with these CCTV networks that you have on a massive scale? And if so, what are the rules and guidelines going to be around them?
I had a question about if there was any research or analysis about some of the mental health impact of some of this, whether or not it's, the stress of a lot of these seem to be in like precarious situations with like students who are already worried in a school or related to prisons or just disadvantaged communities. And, even you mentioned kind of the accuracy is not always there, so that you might be accused of something, even if it's not you. And then if there's like PTSD from there. So I was just kind of curious broadly if that's something that's been studied.
I don't know about kind of for larger kind of quantitative studies. I think a problem with this again is the fact that just use of facial recognition is so often behind a curtain that we still have a lot of problems showing the impact and scale and the use cases. One specific case I will give a shout out to that's just a very powerful story is Robert White. This is one of the 3 known men who have been falsely arrested and put in jail based entirely on a facial recognition match. And kind of go into that sort of, it's hard to find these cases. He only found out because as he was being interrogated and was like, pointing to the picture that they had of the culprit saying, this guy looks nothing like me. One of the officers just casually said, oh, I guess the computer program screwed up, which sort of was a trigger that once he started talking to attorneys, like, oh yeah, that was probably facial recognition, and they dug it up from there. He's written an op-ed about this. He's testified before Congress. And his story is a really powerful example of, even though they, like after about a day realized this is not him, that there are a lot of really trying effects from being arrested in front of your family and being in jail for a day when you're supposed to be in work, and the toll that can take. So I think, it's a good question. It's very important to realize that for these types of errors, even if it's not a sort of, oh, and then this person was, convicted and sent to prison, even if this led to, a fatal police encounter, the idea that, oh, well, this was something we fixed, or that we solved the mistake, doesn't mean that those harms didn't happen or that they go away.
And on the student piece, so just to go back to the student social media monitoring for a moment, there we have done studies about how students feel about it, how parents feel about it. And one of the most interesting findings, this is actually a CDT study that we did, is the extreme chilling effect that students feel. Like when they know they are being monitored, they say that it is affirmatively changing how they express themselves online, how they talk about school. There are concrete examples at a high statistical level of gay students being outed through this technology, for example. And we live in a world now where in certain states in the United States, that really matters, right? That's if teachers find out, that's a report back to parents under laws in Florida. So there are really interesting dynamics at play here of just what it means to be surveilled and that it does end up really impact people's behavior in a significant way.
And on those chilling effects, I think one area where there might be more opportunity to sort of see these effects in place is as opposed to here where facial recognition is often, the government tries to keep it under the radar in a place like China where there is actually kind of a lot of pride in how powerful and pervasive it is. I mean, this is something the government wants people to know. You really do see those same sorts of chilling effects. And this is how, it goes into that idea of use for these very minor offenses. There's some very good reporting about how use for things like jaywalking, for stealing under like $5 of goods or toilet paper of a public restroom, are these cases that are facial recognition used and then used to kind of, whether it's throwing someone on a billboard saying this person, has committed these crimes or just arresting someone afterwards, there is a major chilling effect from that we've seen. And then there's kind of, like the even more severe versions of that for the Uyghur population and how it's used there, and how there is kind of that, all the time we refer to like panopticon as the idea of feeling like you're always watched. I guess it's not quite the right metaphor though, because that's sort of, oh, I feel like I'm always being watched even if I'm not. This is like you actually are always being watched. So it is kind of that next level. And yeah, I mean, it is something we do see that idea of if you're under surveillance, it does change your behavior at a fundamental level.
The Iranian example is another really good one, right? That's them. They were affirmatively coming out saying, we are going to be doing this to enforce compliance with the stricter version of the law mandating wearing of hijab. And you think, okay, well, in that case, they are affirmatively leaning into the chilling effect that it's going to have.
I'm curious, knowing what you both know, how that affects how you use your phones and computers personally. Like, do you use Google Photos? Are you on social media? Those sorts of things, or what you recommend, because a lot of folks here write for a general audience.
I personally am. I really preferred having the thumb unlock to the face unlock. It squigs me out. I feel bad, but I do it. I can't type in my 20-word password every time I need to unlock my phone. I think it is important to kind of, we talk about threat modeling in a lot of tech and cyber respects to, threat model your privacy. What are you worried about? Something like a one-to-one match on a phone is less to worry about. Something like, photos you're putting on online, that's something probably, to think more carefully about. But, I mean, I might worry less about a photo of me on vacation than putting up photos of me at a protest. And, individuals that have less privilege than a white man might need to be more careful and need to think about that threat model a lot differently than I do. I think you do have to kind of look at it case by case of what do you feel the need to be private? What do you feel could be a risk to you?
I also find that informs my advocacy because when it comes down to it, there's only so much that a user can do, right? We need to be, you need to walk down the street and you need to not cover your face as you walk down the street, and you want to go to a protest and, actually be able to be there. And so threat modeling, I think, is the appropriate way to think about it in the world we live in today. As advocates, it is very motivating to me to think about a world where it doesn't have to be just users protecting themselves, because there are safeguards in place and there are limits on how the technology is being used. That comes up a lot in the advocacy around reproductive privacy right now. So just to hark back to the session I understand you had yesterday, that rash of articles that came out over the summer about delete your period tracking app. On the one hand, I was glad to see that people were writing about health data privacy. On the other hand, it made my stomach go in knots, because I thought, God, if people are thinking that the solution is just delete that one app on your phone and you're good to go, we have a real problem with people understanding the much broader systemic effects in play. And so, yes, you need to take those steps. And if you're going to a reproductive health clinic, don't take your phone with you. But also, we need rules of the road. We need limits on what data companies can share. We need reasonable limits on what law enforcement can do. And so as advocates, that's something we really try to carry forward, is it cannot be on the shoulders of users alone.
I was wondering if you could explain a bit what happens in the facial recognition system when it captures someone who has their face partially obscured. If you're wearing a mask or something, does that mean that the system just can't feed back any results, or does it mean it feeds back, more potential results because it's going by half a face as opposed to a full face?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you want to take a cut at it?
It depends on the system and how it's programmed. And this kind of goes to that issue of, we've talked a lot about the bias concern. It's something we should keep talking about. I very much worry if you've heard some law enforcement entities or vendors say, we've actually got to the point of statistically significant bias. So we've solved it. So no more accuracy problems. There are always going to be accuracy concerns with facial recognition. Even if that's true, I would like to see those, claims that they don't have it vetted in more yearly tests. But you're always going to have potentially, partial matches of faces, bad lighting, things like that. And that goes into where these things like the programming kick in. So sometimes a system, it'll need to hit a certain accuracy threshold, a confidence threshold, to pull up matches. And it's usually not one match. It's usually a candidate list of, here are the 5 closest matches. Here's the confidence threshold for each of them. So maybe if the system's programmed a certain way, it might say, we can't pull up anything from that. A pretty common technique is just a auto set of return 5 matches every time, return 10 matches every time. even if it is, if it's half a face or if it's a very blurry image or a very dark image. So then you're kind of going off of, well, this is the closest we could find, but it might be completely unreliable. This is something I know the FBI systems is programmed to auto provide. I believe they do something between like 25 and 50 matches. And if I could just go on a main tangent, this is also when those accuracy questions get very murky, because that's sort of, if it pulls up 50 people and, number 47 out of 50 in terms of the likelihood turns out to be the right person, that is considered a match. Even if, you potentially go through 20, 30, 40 people first, and those might be your higher suspects who were not a match. Another aspect of that we haven't talked about much is the sort of very sketchy facial recognition uses. So, techniques like going off of a composite sketch or, a police sketch instead of a photograph. There's one very notorious case where they didn't have really a good photo of a guy stealing beer from a convenience store, but the police were like, he looks kind of like Woody Allen. So they scanned Woody Allen and then turned the matches from that. Or the really common one, this is one that only found, like there was an op-ed a couple years ago from the NYPD commissioner who was bragging that they do this, is they'll take half a face, take the photo, reverse mirror it, or use some combination of that in CGI, fill it in, oh, now I have a full face, now I'll scan it. Our faces are very similar. It is very, very rare for someone to actually have a symmetrical face. So you are, in that sense, kind of creating a digitally altered, digitally inaccurate face that you're now scanning and treating as what you're putting on the input data. There's another really good Georgetown report on this called Garbage In, Garbage Out that I recommend, that talks about these kind of various sketchy methods that get used, like sketches, lookalikes, and most commonly, and again, this is something that, like, as far as it's a sketchy method, I believe, scientifically, but it's something that's treated as so normal that this is something that the biggest police department in the country is writing op-eds in the New York Times bragging about the fact that they do this, is taking CGI and building pieces of a face and then scanning that as though it's a photo.
I think, oh, okay, last question.
Just a quick question. How effective is it over time? I'm thinking of a DMV photo that, that the police may have from when you're 20. How accurate is that 30 years later or whatever? In other words, does the ID, pixels or the identifying information, is it unique to you and it remains so over time?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those constantly moving ones. I mean, the type of research we've seen so far does pretty consistently show that accuracy of facial recognition degrades between 5 to 10 years after a photo is taken. How much it does so, depends a lot on the algorithm, depends on the photo quality. And that is one area I think as time goes on, it will continue to get better and better. So yeah, I think a lot of it depends on circumstances, but in general, that is one area of, your face does not always look the same as it does, 5, 10, 20 years ago. And that does limit the ability to actually to use those systems.
Okay, well, I think this fits in our theme of fascinating and frightening. So, let's give them a hand. Thank you.